Well, so begin there, guys. Brian, the Three Topics Gamer here to share with you another one of my awesome ranking videos, as we'll be going over the worst to best entries in the very successful and popular Star Wars Battlefront series. Now, before I begin, I would really appreciate if you could smack that subscribe button, as well as press any of the links in the description down below so you can follow me on any of my social media outlets, and I'll be sure to friend you or follow you back, because that is the best way to keep in contact with me directly. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, I would just like to also make a note that before we go into this rankings list, I would like to let you guys know that I'll be going over 6 installments in the series. However, the only entry that I will not be mentioning is 2009's Star Wars Battlefront. I believe it's called Mobile Squadron, that came out in 2009, simply because I not only have never played that game, but I have absolutely no means of actually somehow getting my hands on it to review. So we're just gonna push that thing aside and ignore it. And before we begin, I would just like to let you guys know that if you happen to be a so-called Disney Star Wars fan or fan of the newer Battlefront games, you might want to prepare yourself, because I am not holding back any punches. So, that said, let's jump right into the number 6 in worst ranking Star Wars game in this Battlefront franchise. And we are starting off with... Ranked lowest on my list has to go to 2015's Star Wars Battlefront EA. My primary reason for placing it lowest is because it is without a doubt the most lacking and disappointing entry in the franchise. I was actually in the crowd at E3 2013 when this game was first announced, and with all the advantage that it had working in its favor, it's shocking just how much lacking in content it ended up having. The only good thing that this game gets right is that the main gameplay style is solid and that it looks and sounds good for Star Wars. But damn it, that's not nearly enough to get a pass by me. Looking and sounding like Star Wars is a given for a game coming out in 2015. It's what you do with the property that I care about the most, and it simply was a constant chain of disappointment after disappointment with how much this game is lacking. For starters, the prequel era is completely ignored. That alone is enough to piss me off when this game came out, as EA and DICE practically spit in the face of an entire generation of fans, which is a mistake that not even the very first Battlefront game made. Next, you have no campaign, and for the mass majority of games, that would also be enough for me to prevent me from even buying your game, and what's left in its place is just downright lacking. They have completely removed the majority of gameplay modes that were in the first 2 Battlefront games, and even worse, though this game does have vehicle-on-vehicle combat, for whatever reason they felt the need to not have any space battles. Why? This is Star Wars we're talking about. Even in 2019, there's not a single Star Wars movie that I have seen that didn't have some kind of battle or chase in space. So to completely remove them is just insulting to the franchise in a whole. But the biggest sin that this game commits were the ridiculously overpriced season passes. We are now living in an age that even if you pick this game at a full price at release, you were not even given 50% of the amount of content that you should have access to at the time. Star Wars Battlefront EA is a perfect example of how not to handle such a popular franchise, and though improvements would certainly be made in the follow-up, some of the same mistakes would also be presented and would not only carry over, but in some cases it would make even bigger mistakes, but we'll talk about that later on, which is why it is more than enough reason why this title ranks lowest on my list. Number 5 on my list has to go to the first installment that was made exclusively for portable devices, and that is Star Wars Battlefront Renegade Squadron. Now, unlike Star Wars Battlefront EA, there is actually a campaign with a story presented here. And though it has very few attachments to the official storyline of the games, as it mostly takes place between the events of Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, as you follow the events of a special unit that was created by Han Solo and a rebel general to take part in a series of covert operation missions during the Galactic Civil War, that's really all you need to know going in. The gameplay style is very similar to the previous installments, and when it came out, it did add a few new additions. In Renegade Squadron, you actually have the ability to customize the very look and class of your character. During space battles, you will actually be able to enter asteroid bases during battles in some maps, and one element that really sticks out, at least for me, was how the game actually encourages you to change up your character to better deal with the constant changing operations of each mission. This very much prevented the game from getting too repetitive, with all new maps in which were some that were not even presented in previous installments. It gives it its own variation when compared to other entries. If there's any flaws that really stick out in this entry in the series, it is the fact that the AI at times is not very consistent from mission to mission in terms of the challenge factor, and the fact that this game did come out on the PSP, which really limited its capabilities. But even though this game isn't great, and I certainly wouldn't encourage anyone to go out of the way to play this game, it is quite impressive to see what this game was able to do with such limitations, which is what grants it its spot on my list. Number 4 on my list has to go to Star Wars Battlefront Elite Squadron, which, game mechanically wise, was probably the closest thing that we ever got to a classic Star Wars Battlefront 3 game that unfortunately was never made. Story-wise, it is probably the most confusing one in the entire franchise because you play as a clone trooper called X2 who is created from the DNA of a Jedi Master. And since this game does take place over the course of episodes 3 to 6, one has to ask why the Jedi didn't seem to have a problem with one of their own being cloned. Anyway, when it comes to its gameplay, without question, the most impressive addition that was added to this game was the immersion and transition between land and air battles, as you can literally take a ship on the ground and fly it immediately into a space battle during the same conflict. And what you did in one area could actually have serious effects on the condition of the other battlefield. And from the test footage that we saw for Battlefront 3, this sort of transition between battlefields was something that Battlefront 3 would have had. A new online mechanic that was also introduced for the portable devices, this time being the PSP and the Game Boy DS, was the ability for two players to play against each other online during Galactic Conquest. And though at the time Elite Squadron received mixed reviews, it certainly served as a great upgrade over Renegade Squadron, improving upon a lot of the gameplay mechanics that were introduced in that game, while also providing a solid blueprint of what we could have had, which I find rather cool. Number 3 on my list has to go to the most recent entry, that being Star Wars Battlefront 2 EA, which in my opinion is a perfect example of a developer that improved and expanded upon everything that was good about the previous installment. They even learned and fixed a number of mistakes that they made in the first Battlefront EA game. But for some reason, they came back and made even bigger mistakes and added even more controversy this time around. Now this time, they actually did go out of the way to create a campaign that spans between episodes 6 to 7. And there was certainly a lot of potential to tell a really interesting story from the Imperial's point of view. Sadly, this idea is dropped only a few missions in and quickly turned into the most uninteresting and predictable storyline in a Star Wars game to date, to the point where even the main character becomes completely forgotten at times and instead is replaced with a bunch of random and meaningless cameos from prominent characters from the classic trilogy. If you're not going to find a meaningful way to integrate these characters into your story, then you shouldn't waste your time and mind by bringing them in. Now, in terms of gameplay style, visuals, sound design, this is without question the best Star Wars game in terms of actually experiencing the chaotic battles throughout the Star Wars lore, with all of the additional DLCs added since actually making the game much more enjoyable than it was when the game first came out. But what brings this experience down in a terrible way was the inclusion of the loot box system, and without question the worst progression system that I have ever seen in a video game to date. After finishing this story, I got maybe only, say, 2 hours of enjoyment playing on my own and in multiplayer before I began to really get bored and felt that continuing to play was just a waste of my time. They didn't even have the balls to bring back the single best gameplay mode in Galactic Conquest, which has been a staple in the original 4 Battlefront games throughout the LucasArts era. And with everything that this game had to offer, this is just such a waste of potential. Battlefront 2 EA is like someone taking 4 steps forward and 3 steps back. You may be in a better place than you were when you started, but it's not saying much, and I would only recommend you getting this game at a sales price, which is why it gets the number 3 spot on my list. Number 2 on my list has to go to the very game that started it all, and that is the very first Star Wars Battlefront from 2004. Now, not enough can really be said about this game for what it ultimately ended up achieving and how it really set the standards for what every entry should moving forward have to achieve, and it did an incredible job at giving us, the fans of both the original and prequel trilogies, a chance to play through a series of classic battles. Everything about this game, from the gameplay style to the size of the maps to even the collection of planets, was also very well handled and respectable here. This really was, for me, the perfect pick up and enjoy Star Wars games, and at the time it only had 3 gameplay modes in Campaign, Galactic Conquest, and Instant Action. Though the main campaign is certainly lacking in the story department, I do think that its transition between key prequel battles and key original battles is handled very well. The Galactic Conquest mode has been a staple of the franchise, and any Star Wars Battlefront game without it should be ashamed of itself. And the Instant Action is simply a mode that allows you to jump in and fight any battle any way you want with any faction amongst the 4. What the first Battlefront game did was establish the blueprint of how you make a great Star Wars game of this kind, and in my opinion is the standard for which all that follows should be compared to. Number 1 on my list was always going to be Star Wars Battlefront 2 from 2005, which I not only view as the greatest Battlefront game in the series, but to this day remains my favorite Star Wars game ever created. Everything that Battlefront 1 presented is simply improved upon here in every single way. There are more planets to fight on, there is a much higher variety of maps, with there now being 24 presented this time around. Space battles were introduced and, in my opinion, are handled better here than in any other Battlefront game. The hero characters on both sides feel equally powerful against one another. The campaign here is by far one of my favorite in any Star Wars game, as it spans from the beginning of the Clone Wars and Attack of the Clones all the way to the Battle of Hoth and Empire Strikes Back, with the narration here handled so perfectly that it really gives you a much better understanding of how the clones felt and how the galaxy changed over the course of the 2 wars, and brings so much depth to a really significant part of time, which would ultimately solidify why the Clone Wars era is my favorite era throughout Star Wars. The Galactic Conquest mode, in my opinion, is handled more like a chessboard and feels very well managed, as you have to maneuver your forces throughout the galaxy and must take part in assaulting enemy planets as well as defending your own planets, with the occasional space battle thrown in, with a series of perks that you can purchase and use in just about every battle you engage in. The Instant Action mode was greatly improved upon here with the addition of Hunt mode and Hero Assault. When you put all of these factors together, you get a Star Wars game that is just pure fun to play for hours and hours. And no matter how many times I played on each map, played as each hero or villain, or piloted each vehicle, I never once got bored. This is the one Star Wars game out of any in the series that I would happily pay full price just to get an HD remastering or just purchase again on the PlayStation Store. Even after 14 years, no Battlefront game since then has even come close to achieving the level of quality that this game provides. And even though visually this game looks clearly outdated, much like the original trilogy, even since 2005, it has yet to lose any of its charm, which is why Star Wars Battlefront 2 2005 will always remain my favorite entry in the series. And that concludes my ranking of the Star Wars Battlefront series. So, now that you guys know my ranking, I would like to know, how would you guys rank this list? Share your thoughts and your rankings with me and everyone else in the comments down below. And if you like this video, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and be sure to share it on all your social media outlets in order to spread the word. And like always, I'd like to thank you guys for watching. You're awesome. And if you have any more franchises you think that would make for a great worst versus best series video, be sure to let me know. And I will see you next time.